With that in mind, I want to just jump into today's message. So in this series of sermons, we are looking at and listening to the voices of millennials and Gen Z, and we're asking, what are the critical issues from their vantage point in the world today? And really, we're phrasing this in this way: what would Jesus say about these things? We did a survey with 500 millennials and Gen Z who are part of our congregation. We laid out before them 20 of the major concerns that are listed across the country in surveys of millennials and Gen Z, and said, which are the most important to you? And we're taking the top 4. Today, we're going to talk about the single most important issue on our survey of millennials and Gen Z, and that is mental health. And I wanted our millennials and Gen Z to have a chance to help us think about this issue. Take a listen.
The most critical issue we're facing today is mental health.
I believe this is the most important issue because people are suffering, and they're suffering in silence.
Older generations don't understand what goes on in their kids' heads and what could possibly be hurting them.
It's stigmatized and it's not well understood.
The pressures of social media and the isolation that comes with that.
I think the struggle to be perfect and the struggle to do everything well and succeed.
I think there's a lot of pressure, especially from where we live and the schools that we go to do the best you can and be the best that you can be, which is great, but a lot of times it piles up and students can't handle all of that.
Older generations tend to see mental health as just this stigma that teenagers and millennials have kind of come up with.
The most critical issue we're facing today is mental health.
The most critical issue is mental health.
Mental health.
Mental health.
Mental health.
Mental health.
Talk about mental health. So surveys or studies that have been done both in Switzerland, New Zealand, and the United States have all come up with the same number, and that is roughly 80% of all Americans, or those in Switzerland or New Zealand, 80%, by the time they reach midlife, will have struggled with some form of mental illness somewhere along the way. This is not just that group over there that's going to struggle with mental illness. This is all of us, 80% of us. So if you look around this room, 80% of the people sitting in here at some point are going to struggle with deep depression, clinical depression. We're going to struggle with deep anxiety issues. We might struggle with bipolar disorder, a host of these kinds of things. This is us. This isn't somebody else. This isn't just millennials and Gen Z. This is all of us. 19% of us will struggle with anxiety in any given year. Not just a little bit anxious, but I mean real clinical anxiety that affects your life. 19%, that's 1 in 5 people sitting around this room. That's 1 or 2 people in every row in this room. 7% will struggle with depression, 1 in 14 people. 4% will struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder. 3% will struggle with bipolar disorder. And then there's a host of other things that human beings struggle with. This is a part of living. It's a part of life. It isn't somebody else, it is us. And I want us to hear that. You are not alone. If you right now are walking through a time of deep depression or anxiety, you wrestle with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, any of these disorders, you are not alone. You are a part of a family who also recognizes we struggle with these things as well. This is a part of being a human being. The American Psychological Association in October of 2018 released their report called Stress in America, Generation Z. And part of what they noted is that Gen Z, which is made up of children 7 years and up through the age of 24, is more stressed than any other generation in America today. So while we recognize that all of us struggle with these things, we also recognize there's some unique stressors that are found in younger adults today. I want to show you a couple of charts that came from a study that was done by the American Psychological Association. Actually, it was published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology by a number of researchers. And they studied data from about 60 to 70,000 people from age 12 and up over a period of years. And this is one little chart showing us from 2009, the percent of people reporting a major depressive episode in the previous 12 months. So I want you to notice this group down here, the dotted line, are those who are 50 and up. And they have stayed relatively stable. Around 5% of these report a major depressive episode in the last 12 months. This line here are those who were 26 to 49 when the survey was taken. And they report as pretty standardized. They're much higher than those who are older, but they report somewhere around 7.5% have had a major depressive incident in the last 12 months. I want you to notice these 2 lines here. This solid line are those who are 18 to 25. The dotted line are those who are 12 through 17. And I want you to notice, in particular, since 2011, these numbers have shot up from roughly 8% of the population who have experienced some kind of major depressive episode to 13% of the population. That's an increase of 62%. 62%. All right, so we look at that, and then we begin to look at, some other factors or some other things that we might study. We might look at suicide and suicide ideation, that is actually coming up with a plan, seriously contemplating suicide or attempting suicide. Let me just show you the same report. shows us that for people who are 50 and up, that's about 2.5% of the population who have seriously thought about suicide in the last year. For those who are 26 to 49, somewhere around 4.25%. And these numbers have stayed relatively stable. Then I want you to notice these numbers up here. These are 18 to 25-year-olds. We didn't have the 12 through 17-year-olds. But I want you to notice what's happened to these numbers. Since 2009, these numbers have increased by almost 50% to right at just over 10% of the population. 1 in 10 young people, 18 to 25, in this study of 60 to 70,000, I think the last year was 70,000 people who took the survey, 70,000 people, 1 in 10 young adults who said they had seriously considered suicide in the last year. Okay, and that increase, we've seen this increase happening. So trying to understand that, researchers trying to think, what is happening? Why are we experiencing this? What's going on? So I want to just talk a little bit about some of what I have read that they have felt might be causes behind this. And one of the things is just a very simple factor, and that is young adults are more willing to talk about mental health today than previous generations. So in previous generations, we thought it was a sign of weakness. If you're going to talk about mental health, you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You don't talk to other people about the things that you're feeling when you're feeling terribly afraid or you're feeling deeply depressed or any of these other things. When you're suicidal, you don't dare talk about that. And yet younger generations are teaching us that maybe it's actually healthier to talk about this than to hide it or stuff it down inside or pretend you're not experiencing these things. In addition to this, there are questions about correlations between things that are happening in our society and this rapid increase in deep depression, or at least reports of deep depression and suicide. And so one of those factors, a number of researchers have pointed out, is social media. We talked about this last week when it came to polarization in our country. So social media and the rapid increase of social media. And it's interesting that these increases in reports of suicide and depression among young adults correspond or correlate very closely to the rapid increase in social media. So let's just take a look. We've seen what it looks like to see the increase since 2009 in reports of depression and suicide. This is number of people using social media platforms, and this number right here is Facebook since 2008, going from virtually nobody using it to 2 billion people just in the last 12 years or 11 and a half years. YouTube, which has become a social media platform as well. WhatsApp, which is right here. We have Instagram, which is right over here, and all of these things are seeing this rapid increase at the same period of time when we're seeing increases in suicide, ideation, and in depression. So in addition to these, just to sort of isolate this data, again, from 2008 on, Facebook use, from basically 2011 on, Instagram use. So we're seeing all these things. Now, social media can be a wonderful thing, and it can also be a medium that leaves us isolated socially and leaves us feeling alone or feeling even more depressed. So that a study of young adults found, Gen Z found that 20% of Gen Z felt worse after viewing social media than before. So 80% felt fine, right? It's like 80% is great, but for 20%, they felt worse after viewing social media. And it's not just the idea of viewing social media, it's what they're seeing on social media. And we all can relate to this. So when I post a picture on Facebook, it's usually a picture of me and Stella, or LaVon and me and Stella. And we're out having fun, and we're doing something great, and it's just awesome, and there's just joy in that. And, or LaVon and I, we can be, I'm like, there's a beautiful sunset. We might even be fighting with each other, but I'm like, let's get a selfie with the sunset, right? So we stop, and we smile. Right? And then we're back to this with each other, right, after we're done with taking the picture. But you see, I don't post this on social media. I post this, right? And so there's the picture of the beautiful sunset, and LaVon and I standing there. It just looks like we love each other all the time. We are madly in love with each other all the time. Isn't life great? And we got Stella, and it's just, everything's awesome. That reflects a tiny portion of my life. It doesn't reflect, nobody takes pictures when they're deeply depressed, when they got the flu and their hair is a mess. That nobody takes pictures when they can't stand their spouse, or if they do, it's when they are pretending like that. I mean, social media is the largest source of fake news out there, right? Because out there, we are portraying something about our lives that doesn't really reflect how we are all the time. It's how we are in moments. And those moments are beautiful and wonderful. It's just not how it is all the time. So now I'm feeling a little depressed already, and I'm looking at social media, and your life looks awesome. In fact, every single one of my friends' lives look awesome. They have so many friends, they're doing things, and I'm not included in those pictures, and I'm not feeling that way right now. And so when I'm done, I'm thinking, my life really stinks, and everybody else's is awesome. Right, and then you add to that the fact that we make pointed comments to each other across social media, and we feel the sense of conflict we talked about last week. So there's this constant state of irritation and frenzied activity, and so by the time we're finished, sometimes we feel pretty discouraged. I was watching I think it was a TED Talk or some interview this week with I think he was a therapist, and he was talking about, how we use social media, and often we use it like some people used to use alcohol or drugs. as a way of medicating ourselves. When we feel down, then we go to social media. When we're bored, we go to social media. We end up, doing this, and if we're feeling a little down, we think that's going to pick us up. Instead, it sometimes actually makes things worse. And he said it would be like, especially with younger people who don't know how to process and weigh all of these things. And we're talking about children now, because even though there's an age at which you're supposed to be able to be on Facebook, you can put in a different date for your birthday, and you can jump on Facebook much younger than you should be on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it might be. And he said it'd be like saying to a child, who's not really 21 and not really prepared, hey, you know what? I know you're struggling. Here's the liquor cabinet. Please help yourself. Like, nobody would do that. Except with social media, we don't recognize that for some people, this can be, a deeply discouraging part of our lives, a way of actually reinforcing the bad feelings that we may already be having. Now, there's other reasons why this increase shows up, in addition to the fact that people are, reporting more of this, and young people are willing to talk about it in social media. We also talk about a rise in young adults who feel that they need to be perfect in order to get the approval of their parents. So a study was done in the UK. Since 1989, there's been a rise in, each year they check people at a certain age, 33% of young adults, a rise of 33% of young adults who say that they feel like they have to be perfect in order to get their parents' approval. This is straight A's instead of, 3 A's and 2 B's and a C or whatever it might be, but I need to be perfect in order to get my boss's approval. There's no room for grace or for forgiving myself or letting myself not be perfect. The opioid crisis is another. And interestingly enough, one more factor is that at the same period of time where we find a rapid increase in the number of people who have reported suicidal thoughts and deep depression, we find among young adults a rapid decrease in people who are involved in church, involved in their faith, a decrease in the people who say faith is really important to me. Maybe there's some correlations between all of these things. So we're going to talk just a bit about this today. Now I want to come back to this idea of young adults who are willing to talk about mental health. And I want to tell you, this is a gift to the rest of us. To those of us who are older, this is a gift. The freedom to be able to say, you know what, I'm not perfect, and life is not perfect all the time, and right now I feel really depressed, or I'm struggling with anxiety, to freely be able to talk about this. So thank you to our millennials and Gen Z who are helping us discover this. And I want you to hear once more from some of our young adults that we interviewed about this willingness to destigmatize mental health. Take a listen.
My name's Stephen Ball. I'm 35. I'm a brother. I'm a son. I'm a nephew. I'm single, and I'm a lawyer. I think mental health is an important issue because I don't think baby boomers understand it as well. I don't think they had opportunity to. Access to mental health was different back then. The field itself was different. And I think as a result, many baby boomers grew up with stigmas and with a flawed understanding of how the mental health community can help them live their best life today.
My name is Mandy Anaya. I am a millennial. I am a professor within a PsyD program. That's a clinical psychology program. So I'm very much concerned about mental health. There is this thought that if you have a physical ailment, then obviously you go to the doctor. But if you have a mental ailment, then it's almost like a personality defect that you need to get over it. Anxiety levels are going up in terms of the additional pressures that we're putting on our younger generations and on our kids.
I'm Michael. I'm 36. I'm a millennial. I'm a son, a brother, a husband, a dad, an uncle. When I found a therapist and began going to therapy and getting counseling, as I shared that with some members of my family, some members of older generations, they didn't really know how to take it. Some thought of it as a sign of weakness, that I wasn't able to handle things on my own. At the same time, I joined a gym and started working out, and one of the statements was, "Well, good for you. I'm glad you're at the gym. I'm glad you're working out. I'm glad that's being the thing that's helping you." And so I think oftentimes the older generations maybe don't understand that we need to do things a little differently to be able to take care of ourselves.
My grandmother took her life when she was 45. From the time she was a young person, she was struggling with depression, but nobody talked about it. And by the time she took her life, she had 4 children. My mother was the oldest at 16, and 2 other teenagers and 1 in elementary school. And she cried out for help, but her cries for help were not understood completely. I mean, everybody knew that she was struggling, but they didn't know what to do. And it was, the thought of actually going to a mental hospital was just hugely embarrassing for my grandfather. And for my grandmother, she didn't really know exactly what to do. This is a picture of her when she was in her 20s. I've looked at a number of pictures. She was a beautiful woman. That's one of the few I found where she was smiling. I was born 2 years after she died, and my great aunt, who was her sister, said, if your grandmother had been alive today, she would have gone to get treatment. She would have taken medication. She would have gotten good therapy, and she wouldn't have died. But that's not how things were then. My mother said, it was such a huge stigma. It was such a huge stigma that there was no way that she was going to reach out for help. So thank God that our millennials and our Gen Z are saying, we have to talk about this. This is really important. So as we talk about this, I want us to recognize, we think about our physical health. We talk about our physical health, no problem. I will tell you, a couple weeks ago, I was eating something and I cracked a tooth or something. I don't know what happened. All I know is that it felt like somebody was taking a ice pick and jabbing it up into my upper jaw, and my pain was all over the side of my face, and so I had to eat with one side of my face. And you know what? You know what I did? I went to the dentist. I said, help! The dentist sent me to the oral surgeon, who then sent me to the endodontist, and I finally got a root canal, and I have a new crown being put on tomorrow. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. That's just my tooth. Can I tell you, your brain is the most powerful organ in your body? It simply is. It has the power of a supercomputer. 1,000 MacBook Pros don't have the storage capacity of your brain. And it determines everything that happens in your life. Like, it takes in all of the inputs, it processes those, it determines what to do with them, it makes your heart beat faster, it causes your blood pressure to rise. It affects your vision, not only what you see taking it in, but how you see things. It is the storage unit for all of your memories, and then it tries to put together those memories to figure out whether you should be afraid or not afraid. And you know what? Like a supercomputer, or any kind of computer, including my little phone, sometimes it gets a glitch. Like my phone, it seems like every other day there's some little thing I got to do something to restart it or do something to get it right. You know what? Your brain is the same way. And it's affected by all of the other things that are going on around you. So what you eat affects your brain. How you sleep affects your brain. How much daylight there is outside affects your brain. What you're listening to on the news affects your brain. All of these things, right, affect your central processing unit. When I have a problem with my computer, you know what I do? I call IT. When you have a problem with your central processing unit, it might be good to call somebody who might be able to say, hey, that's normal, it's okay. Or, you know what don't we try this? Or, you know what, I think maybe your brain chemistry is off just a little bit. Let's see if we can get you some help. But in generations past, we thought we were supposed to suffer through that. Can you imagine if your phone's not working and you just say, well, you know what, it's just gonna be that way, I'm not gonna do anything about it. My computer's not quite right, I didn't get the numbers right in my spreadsheet. No problem, I'll just keep dealing with it that way. No, my tooth, I'm gonna get it fixed. So why not be able to talk about what's going, what we're feeling inside, the fact that I'm feeling overwhelmed right now, or I feel really depressed, or I'm really anxious, or I don't understand what I'm feeling, or I'm hearing voices in my head. Help is the right thing to say, not maybe it'll just go away. I think about my physical well-being. I try to take care of my heart. I take a baby aspirin every day. Nobody thinks about taking a baby aspirin every day, or I take a statin. I don't have bad cholesterol, but the doctor says, let's just be sure. Let's, make sure it's just as low as we can get it. And I'm like, great, that's awesome. Well, sometimes, what's going on up here might need a little medical treatment too. It might be a little pill we have to take that's going to help us. There's no shame in that, just like there's no shame in taking a baby aspirin or taking a statin, right? You want to make sure you got a good doctor who's making sure they're analyzing and checking things out carefully, and if that pill doesn't work, and you maybe need another pill. And somewhere along the way, it may not just be a pill. In fact, often it's not just a pill. It's being able to talk through what are the factors that are facing or affecting how I'm thinking or processing things. Right? And it's not just having somebody who's a professional to talk through things. Sometimes it's having friends to talk through things with. Or just to be able to say, look, this is how I'm feeling. Can you help me? Can you walk with me through this? All of these things become important. And just like I'm going to try to get good exercise to take care of my body, I want to get good exercise to take care of my mind. Now, I would love it if I could, in a 30-minute sermon, give you the answer to every form of mental illness and mental struggle that we face. Do you think that's possible? Of course that's not possible. I mean, our mental health and the fact that our brains act in funny ways and we experience different, things that aren't pleasant, that's a part of being human. Every human being since the beginning of time has experienced those kinds of things. And 80% of us are going to experience some major episodes somewhere in our lives. So this is part of what it means to be human. And it's not like there's going to be, if I can give you a magic verse from the Bible and it's going to make it all okay. But there are certain things that we can do. So I want to just briefly mention 6 things that is, as I was reading and studying this week, 6 things that are just commonplace practices that we might do. And then I want to focus on what Jesus would say. So as I think about these 6 things, the first one is meaningful in-person relationships. Meaningful in-person relationships. This is not the same as connecting with people on social media. I got 50,118 people who like my Facebook page. Do you think they're all my friends? I don't know how many of those are my friends. Some of them hate me who are on there. And they just follow just to be able to say bad things on there. That's just life. So yeah, I'll tell you this. When I'm struggling with something, I text somebody and say, hey, I'm really struggling with something. And I get a little sad face emoji with tears coming out of it. As I've said before, that is not the same thing as somebody putting their arms around my neck and saying, hey man, I love you. Let's go get a cup of coffee and let's talk. Right? Somehow we need meaningful in-person relationships. And the way Paul talks about this is we're to bear one another's burdens. We carry each other. We're stretcher bearers for each other. That's not on social media, not on our phones. That's in real in-person conversations. The second is sleep. So sleep has a huge role in shaping how our brain processes what's going on. Do you know this, that every night when you sleep, if you get good sleep, that your brain is purging itself of its toxins that are in there? There's actually a chemical wash that comes across the brain, and your brain shrinks at night when you're sleeping in a good way because it's getting rid of stuff that shouldn't be in there, and then it's logging in the short-term memories into long-term memory. But if you don't get enough sleep, neither of those things are happening. So here's one of the things that I've found. This last year, I have been stressed out with what's going on in our denomination and the conflict, and I haven't been able to sleep, and I have been, at night, I wake up 3 or 4 times, and then I'm a mess the next day. Not a mess, but it just isn't great when you're not sleeping well. And I stumbled onto something. You'd think as a pastor I would have figured this out a long time ago, but here's what I stumbled onto. If I stop reading social media an hour before I go to bed, and then if I exercise, I have a 7-minute workout that I do on my phone. If I exercise for 7 minutes and then I open my Bible just before I go to bed and I read it, and I read a half a chapter, right now I'm reading through the Gospel of John, I read a half a chapter of the Gospel of John, and I look to see what did Jesus say and do, and then I pray and I trust my life to him, I sleep like a baby all the way through the night. It's pretty surprising how that works. It may not work for you, but it certainly has worked for me. Because when I turn off social media, I turn off all the stuff that's going to be playing in my head throughout the night that's going to wake me up and cause me to lay there and toss and turn and worry about things. And instead, I've thought about who Jesus is and the role he plays in my life, and I've entrusted my life to him before I go to sleep. Try it and see if that might not work for you. Exercise and proper diet are really important. If those affect our brain, then getting these things right can be really, really important. Mental health training, and when I say mental health training, I'm thinking about going to see a coach. And the kind of coach I'm talking about might go by the name of therapist, right? Or counselor, a psychologist, or sometimes psychiatrist, somebody who's going to be able to help me, and in particular, retraining my neural pathways, because I get in a habit of thinking a certain way, and there are tapes that play in my head, and I need to erase those tapes or retrain my thinking, and sometimes I need somebody else to hear in order to help me think about that. So sometimes our coach is a friend or a counselor or a pastor, but somebody who's going to help me to get my brain, oriented in the right direction. And part of that is gratitude. Part of it's just simply saying thank you to God every day. There's a whole host of very simple things that we can do that can retrain our brain. Medication, as I mentioned, is one of those. And then faith. Faith is our worldview. It's how we understand, in the end, what happens when I'm facing the most difficult of circumstances. What is the answer to that? Is there anybody who's with me? Is there any hope? Is the worst thing the last thing? I mean, this is what faith does in our lives. And here's one of the things that I found interesting. I mentioned this a moment ago, that we see this large increase in young adults who are struggling with depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, these kind of things. At the same time that we see an increase in young adults who say, I'm nothing in particular when it comes to religion. I'm spiritual but not religious. I don't go to church or synagogue. I don't really have these patterns of spiritual disciplines in my life. And I have to wonder, is there not some serious connection between giving up faith and a religious community and finding ourselves struggling when we're feeling hopeless or anxious? So Robert Whitley, writing in Psychology Today, noted this: higher levels of religious belief and practice, known in social science as religiosity, is associated with better mental health. In particular, the research suggests that higher levels of religiosity are associated with lower rates of depression, lower rates of anxiety, lower rates of substance use disorder, and lower rates of suicidal behavior. Religiosity is also associated with better physical health and subjective well-being. Now, not every exercise of religiosity would do that. If you go to a church where they're filling you with shame every single week, where they are, making you angry towards other people, where they're not teaching you about the love of God and giving you hope and not helping you be called to love your neighbor and expressing gratitude, well, you're probably in a place that might be increasing your mental dishealth. But if you're in a place that's healthy, that's focused on the gospel, these should be helping and enhancing your life and your mental well-being. Okay, so that leads me to the question, what would Jesus say about mental health? So all of the things that we talk about today as mental health disorders, they were all present in the biblical times as well. These are not new. Human beings have wrestled with these things. They just didn't have names for them. So the biblical people who knew war and violence and bloodshed, they knew PTSD. They'd all experienced that. Right? The people in the biblical times, the biblical authors and those they were writing to, they knew deep depression. They understood anxiety. You find this throughout the scripture. They struggled with the thoughts of self-harm. All of these things were a part of the biblical period. So I think about when you're reading the Bible and you're looking for these things, you've got two biblical figures, leading figures, Moses and Elijah, who both prayed to God to die. Right? They were thinking, I don't want to live anymore. Just like maybe you felt that way and thought that way. These are two pivotal figures, and yet they didn't give up. They continued to go, and God somehow strengthened them in the process of their journey. I think about Job and Lamentations. These are the author of Lamentations and Job both went through traumatic things, and they exhibit signs of PTSD in the work that they have written or the works that are about them. The book of Psalms was written, it's the heart and soul of the Bible, and right there in the middle of the Bible, it reflects the experiences that human beings have across the course of their life. There are mountaintop experiences reflected in the Psalms, where the psalmist is so grateful for God's grace and love and God's deliverance, and you just feel this exuberant joy, but you also find the psalmist in the pit. Actually, they literally describe being in the pit. And will you save me, God? And where are you right now? So that in Psalm 42, verse 3, we read these words, my tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? The psalmist was probably saying to himself, where is my God? I think about Psalm 22, verse 1. Jesus quotes it from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? Or elsewhere in the Psalms where it says, God, the dead don't praise you. Are you going to help me? Or how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? I mean, these are all feelings that people had in biblical times as well. But here's what we find in the Bible is they had those feelings, and yet they hung on to their faith. With white knuckles, they held on, and they refused to let go of God in the midst of their pain or their heartache. When we look at Jesus, we see Jesus spends most of his time with people who are hurting and broken. You remember the Pharisees came and they want to know why Jesus associates with all of these broken people and all these messed up people. Why do you associate with people like that? And Jesus says it's not the well who need a doctor. It's the sick who need a doctor. Jesus has compassion for people who are broken, people who are hurting, people who feel hopeless and helpless. He came to be with these people. And you see so many times Jesus is addressing, when he's healing people, he's addressing what I believe were psychosomatic illnesses. Not always. There are times he literally heals somebody of a literal physical ailment, but there are other times where he's addressing what's going on in their mind that's affecting their body. So he says to people, your faith has made you well. What does that mean? It means that in their mind, they chose to trust that there was a God who loved them, who cared about them, who wanted them to walk again, who wanted them to see, who wanted them to hear, that there was a God who was with them no matter what. So once the peak example of this is a man who was a paralytic. He was paralyzed, and his friends brought him to Jesus. And you remember what Jesus said to him? He looked at him, and he didn't say, oh, Father, please help this paralyzed man walk again. He looked at him, and he says, your sins are forgiven. And when he said, your sins are forgiven, the man got up and walked. He was overwhelmed with shame and guilt, which had left him paralyzed, physically paralyzed. But Jesus healed this man. I think of Mary Magdalene, out of whom there were 7 demons that Jesus cast. Well, remember in the first century, demons, they might have been, in cases in the Gospels, actual spiritual entities that were afflicting people. But you see, in the first century, people didn't have names like schizophrenia to give to the experience they had. When people were hearing voices or they were acting in erratic ways, all they could think of was that there was some demon that was affecting them. Some of these people were struggling with mental illness, and Jesus sets Mary Magdalene free of her pain, free of her shame, free of whatever it was that she was experiencing that led others to say that she had 7 demons, and Jesus released her from that and loved her. At the very least, what we can say about Jesus and mental health is that he had deep compassion, that he sought out people who were broken, that he walked with them on their journey, and that for many of them, he brought healing to them. How did he bring healing to them? And what I would like is I would like to be able to pray for you in whatever you've cancer or job loss or infertility or mental illness. I would love to pray for you and instantaneously you're better. Like Jesus actually could do that, which is just awesome. I guess when God comes and takes on flesh and walks in the world, that is certainly a very real possibility. But that isn't the way that the Lord always heals, and today isn't the way he normally heals. I love what Carl Menninger said. You remember the great psychiatrist out of Topeka, Kansas. He said this, it is unlove that makes us unwell, and it is love and only love that can make us well again. Now, I actually think that's a bit of an overstatement. Sometimes we need medication, sometimes we need therapy, sometimes we need friends. But the big idea is right, and that is often it is our lack of love that has left us hurting, and it is love that we receive that helps us and strengthens us and carries us and heals us in the midst of our pain. Jesus said to people who were struggling with schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, overwhelming guilt, he said this, "You matter to me. You matter to God. You are loved. Come and follow me." That's what Jesus said. I love the fact one of his prime disciples, in fact, the leading disciple among women who followed Jesus was Mary Magdalene, a woman who had been said to have had filled or overwhelmed by 7 demons. And Jesus chose her to follow him. So we rest in him, we trust in him, we listen for his voice, we believe he's with us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of our mental health issues go away if we just do that. And this is where I think sometimes Christians get it wrong. I remember once I saw a youth director wrote a little column to his youth group, and he says, if you're a Christian, you won't be depressed. And I wrote him and I said, that's an interesting thing to say given the fact that you find so many people in the scriptures who struggle with depression. That just simply is not true. Following Jesus doesn't mean that you're never going to get depressed or you're never going to feel anxious or you're never going to struggle with anything in your life. What it means is I know he's by my side when I'm walking through the darkness. And because he's by my side, somehow I feel like it's going to be okay when I trust he's with me. This week I went to visit somebody at the hospice house here in Kansas City, a woman in our congregation who's very near death. And there had been thousands of people praying for her. I'd been praying for her. I prayed for her from the top of Mount Sinai, with her cancer. And when I saw her husband, he said, I'm worried what this is going to do to my faith that my wife's going to die. And I had so many people praying for her, and I thought she was going to get better. And I said, I was praying for a grand slam out of the park home run miracle for your wife too, but I said, and I know I've taught you this before, and I know it's hard to remember sometimes in a moment like this. But when Jesus came to the earth, he didn't come so that every single human being who ever struggles with physical or mental illness would be instantaneously healed if they would just pray hard enough or get enough people praying for them. He came to walk in the midst of our stuff, of our pain, of our brokenness. I want you to remember that he hung on a cross at the age of 33 and was tortured to death as a young adult. That's how his story, his life story ended, but it wasn't really the end of his story, because on the 3rd day he rose from the grave, and this was God's way of saying that yes, you're going to walk through hell on earth sometimes, and there's going to be pain, and there's going to be sorrow and heartache, and sometimes there will come for all of us death. But none of these things get to have the final word. I say this over and over and over again, so maybe if there's nothing else you ever remember, it's this idea that none of these things get to have the final word. Because that's what the gospel says when we look at the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. We see a God who has compassion and mercy and who loves us, and he's not promising that every bad thing in our life is going to be instantaneously healed. That's not how he works. He works through people to come alongside us and carry us. He works through his Spirit to comfort us and console us. He promises us that he's going to take the painful things in our lives and he will wring something good from them, and that he's going to walk with us no matter what, and that the worst thing isn't the last thing. No, Jesus doesn't always take away the challenges and afflictions. Often, though, he does work in and through them. He doesn't cause them, but he works in and through them. I was thinking about this week. I was researching people who had mental illness and who did amazing things with their lives. Maybe you've looked at these lists. Abraham Lincoln struggled with clinical depression. Some people historians think that maybe it was that gave him the capacity to do what he did in finally ending slavery in the country and being willing to fight for that. Or Winston Churchill, who had bipolar disorder. Or Martin Luther King, who struggled with depression his entire life. Or more modern people, I think about former Kansas City Royal Ben Zobrist, played second base for the Royals, who struggled with anxiety and depression, or still struggles with it. Catherine Zeta-Jones, bipolar. Going backwards, Charles Dickens, depression. Beethoven, bipolar. All of these people, none of them were instantaneously cured of these things. They had to do all the hard work that we do of having people come alongside us, and sometimes medication, and many of them didn't have access to medication or even talked about it or know what words to put to it. And yet somehow their genius and the amazing things that they did was in part a result of the way that they lived with the afflictions that they faced. That leads me to our scripture story, and this is where I want to close. One of the best loved stories in the Bible is Jesus sends his disciples in a boat across the Sea of Galilee, and it's dark, right? And the Sea of Galilee is not huge, but it's deep. It's about 3 or 4 times deeper than the Lake of the Ozarks. And they're out in the middle of the water, and a storm comes up, and there they are on this 20-foot boat, and the wind and the waves are rocking the boat, and they know they're going to die. They're not going to survive this, and they are terrified. And Jesus comes walking to them on the water. to the boat, and they see Jesus walking, and they don't realize it's Jesus, and they're even more scared now. They think a ghost is coming after them. The demons from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee are going to come and suck them down. That's what I think what they're thinking. And Jesus speaks to them. And you remember what he says? He says, "It's me. I'm here. Don't be afraid. It's me. I'm here. Don't be afraid." You know, I believe the gospel writers included this story in the Gospels not as a promise that anytime you're in a boat and a storm comes up, it's all going to be fine because Jesus is going to come walking to you on the water in the middle of the Lake of the Ozarks, in the middle of the night when a storm comes up. No, they're not saying that. Here's what they were trying to say is, you know, what happened there is a picture of what Jesus does in your life today, because when you're in the middle of a storm in your life, mentally, psychologically, you know, emotionally, maybe it's economically, maybe whatever, relationally, in the middle of the storms in your life, Jesus comes to you. He comes to you, and what does he do? You remember he comes and Simon Peter sees him out there, and the wind and the waves are still going crazy while Jesus is standing there outside the boat on the water. And Simon says, he didn't say, "Hey, get in here with us, Jesus." He says, "Let me come out there to you." And Simon Peter gets out of, "Jesus, come on." And he's stepping out into the water, and you remember the storm is still raging, and as long as Simon Peter, you know the story, as long as Simon Peter kept his eyes focused on Jesus, he was fine, even in the midst of the storm. It's just when that big wind came up and he turned and he looked at the wind and the waves that he began to sink. And the gospel writers are saying, keep your eyes focused on Jesus in the middle of the storms. Right? Jesus eventually gets in the boat with the disciples, and the winds and the waves calm down. But I love this picture of Jesus getting in the boat with you. I don't know what boat you're in right now. I don't know what's going on. I don't know how the winds and the waves are buffeting you. Here's what I know is Jesus wants to ride in the boat with you. And it doesn't mean the storm's going to instantaneously disappear. It just means that Jesus is with you, and somehow, if he's with you, walking with you, it's got to be okay. All right, here's the last thing I want us to know from that story. And as we think about, so what would Jesus say to us today about mental health? How does Jesus work in the world today? How does he address poverty for children living in Kansas City or in other parts of the world? He uses you, right? He uses you at Christmas Eve who write out checks and give $1,483,000. It's not that he dropped the money out of heaven. He touched your hearts and had you do his work for him, right? Before he ascends to heaven, he says, now you go and do the stuff that I have been doing. So what does that mean when it comes to caring for people who are struggling with mental health? It means we're meant to do the same things that Jesus did. It means when we see somebody else who's down, we come alongside them and we carry them, or we sustain them, or we stand with them, or we express love to them. This is what we are called to do. We are called to care for each other and bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. We are called to love one another even as we love ourselves. Emily, a millennial in our congregation, wrote, I'm a millennial in my mid-20s and was given a diagnosis of depression and anxiety my senior year in high school. In my experience, however, fighting off the depression in particular has everything to do with human connection. Whenever I find myself at a point of crisis, the one thing that keeps me grounded are the ties I have to people in my life, knowing not only that I have people in my corner, but that I have a purpose and someone else to fight for. That has kept me going. And Julie wrote this, I've suffered with anxiety since I was 11 years old, in the 90s before social media. I feel like my faith was one of the big things that got me through. Prayer and meditation are my go-tos, and when I'm feeling anxious, I still suffer with anxiety, and when I get overwhelmed, I get quiet and I meditate, or I have a conversation with God about how I'm feeling, and I begin to feel the wind, these are my words, the wind and the waves subside. We are called to care for one another, and we are called, invited, to put our trust in, to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. And in that, we find peace, help, strength, or hope in the midst of our storms. You overwhelmed with mental illness sometimes? That's our common human experience. Jesus walks with you, is with you in the boat, and he's calling us to help one another. And in this way, we fulfill the law of Christ. Let's pray. I'd like to invite you simply to mentally picture Jesus stepping into your life, stepping into your boat, into your car, into your house, just to imagine him taking your hand and walking with you and saying, I'm here, it's me, don't be afraid. And would you simply whisper, Lord, help me keep my eyes focused on you. Help me to trust in you. Help me to walk with you. Take my hurts and my pain and use them for good. and help me pay attention to those who need my care. Use me to bear others' burdens and to love my neighbors. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.